Opinions are important. I'm of the firm belief that that variety of taste is one of the most important freedoms we can hold on to into a modern world where so many others are but theories. Even if I find someone's taste baffling and appalling, I still respect it because that is what they enjoy. Which means that, despite how I'm going to treat this story in this review, if you like it, and I'm aware a lot of people do, and this is much more controversial skewer than Kill the Moon was by a long shot, then I want to be clear I'm playing the ball, not the man. If you enjoy, like, or even love this story, don't let me dissuade you from that. I'd appreciate if you listened anyway, even if you disagree with every word I say, because I think an important part of holding these diversity of views is the ability to discuss and argue them. But I can but make it clear, this review is in no way saying you can't like the story if you do. It's just a pre-warning of how it is. It is of course April Fool's Day, damn it. Which means it's our yearly look at the worst of Doctor Who, and Paradise Towers just leaves me a sense of emptiness these days. Having already reviewed it once for a long-abandoned text blog, I read back that review and find a quite angry, ranty review that no longer fit into my writing style for one, but also seemed just overly aggressive in a way I'm not really when I'm doing these video reviews. I think this reflects the difference in attitude I had in this viewing, where I just felt frustrated, bored, and empty. But honestly, that might even just be a bigger crime than making me angry. The story is just nothingness, a series of bland surface-level engagements, no thought or depth, and the frankly absurd choices reek to me of amateurness and not much else. It's Doctor Who, for me, at its most basic and shallow, and this time around I think that was my biggest problem. It feigns complexity when it has none. To go back to what I said at the start, I know there are some people who like this story for reasons, and for several reasons, and some of those are beyond the usual storytelling. For instance, the Resis and the Kangs, they're girls-only clubs. I can see why lesbians might feel represented by that in a way the show had never done before. Except they're not actually lesbians, are they? I mean, yes, it's pretty obvious on the screen, but they don't come out and say it or make it explicit. Explicit as in clear, not the other kind of... You get the idea. I mean, I don't know how possible it was in BBC One in 1987. My guess is not very. But nevertheless, it feels like only going for enough to have it there without exploring it further. It feels like the story in a nutshell. Those who enjoy the McCoy era for its politics, I'm sure, may also enjoy this one, and there absolutely is, in theory, interesting things to say here. For instance, the law enforcement in Paradise Towers being far more interested in petty crimes like graffiti than the clearly broken system they work in. It has potential, but it doesn't work because, for a start, the broken system is entirely the doing of the villain and not actual societal decay or anything like that. The resolution of how they fix said broken system is pathetic and weak, and well, it's difficult not to get a sense they had no real idea what they were doing with these messages because this one is hidden in a few small bits, whereas the pervading one I get from the comedy about the rules and regulations is the hideously right-wing, no doubt unintentionally but nevertheless still present, message that law enforcement shouldn't need to have to follow rules and regulations, which, call me Mr. Controversial here, but I think the police should have to follow some rules. Shocking, I know. Whatever I want to say about the politics in seasons 25 and 26, it's pretty clear what those politics were, and it wasn't wandering and confused like this. Another reason this story is enjoyed by some is that it's considered to be a bit of camp fun, and well, this is very much a clash of styles, I think. I don't think it's either of these things for a start, but it also plays into how being fun is used to justify being stupid and thoughtless. So much of the thoughtless spectacle of New Who is attempted to be justified on this basis. It's fun that the Doctor is skydiving with a TARDIS because it's like action and stuff. This story is in a similar vein, where idiot ideas, plots and characters are seen as fun because, I don't know, they're silly. I just can't stand this way of thinking, I'm afraid, because it cheapens the idea of fun Doctor Who. Something like City of Death with smart writing and intelligent comedy should be thought of as really fun, not this pink-eared monstrosity yelling hungry. Speaking of which, it's odd there are two terrible Doctor Who stories where the villain yells hungry, fired 2 nickels, etc. and so forth. Anyway, I'll go into that into more detail later, but I did want to explain my objections to some of the usual defences for this story. Again, if you hold those opinions, that's perfectly fine, of course. I'm just stating my counters to those arguments. A right to hold an opinion is not a right to have that opinion unchallenged, though. Anyway, this story comes as part of Season 24, Doctor Who's worst ever season. The crown it still holds, mostly unchallenged despite New Who's many attempts. I've always found it incredible that at a time when the very future of the show was held on a thread, this was what they shat out. This was the time when the show needed to be at its very best to prove its worth, and they pushed out 4 of the worst, most shoddily conceived stories of all time. Dragonfire might be a wonderful experience, of course, but it's because of its incompetence creating entertainment. And it's something I can't say for the other stories, but that doesn't mean it's an impressive achievement in most aspects. Now, to be fair, not a phrase I will use often in this review, the behind-the-scenes situation at this point was beyond the disaster. It's well known the trial of a Time Lord was hell behind the scenes, and the personnel changes that resulted were tumultuous enough to leave a bit of a power vacuum. New script editor Andrew Cartmel was inexperienced and didn't have a grip on what he was doing yet, while John Nathan Turner, only carrying on as producer because he knew there was nobody else to replace him and the show would just end, was kind of checking out. Normally this would be a problem as it would leave the show without leadership when it was badly needed, but given his leadership was pretty much entirely what led to this crisis in the first place, well, it was something the show probably could have done without. So the result was fairly predictable, and one imagines it was basically writer Stephen Wyatt being essentially left alone to produce the story, and the confused, wandering, unfocused, and poorly thought out plot combines with a total inability to explore any of the issues he seemingly wants to explore. Of course, it's worth remembering that the show did make huge improvements for the next two seasons, and while I think it only ever showed improvement and promise rather than truly reaching greatness, it nevertheless was the show at least trying its hardest again, which is not something I got from this season at all. And yet, it didn't make a difference. The damage had long been done by poor creative decisions and bad luck with timing, and the show could have been making Citizen Kane and nobody would have watched it because its reputation was in the toilet and Corey was on the other side at the same time. So don't think I'm suggesting that season 24 was what doomed the show or anything like that. Paradise Towers did not kill Doctor Who. What I am suggesting is they should have been making Doctor Who as if what they made could have made the difference. And they did not. Even if it wouldn't have done in the end. Anyway, I'll start the look proper at the directing of the story. The director was Nicholas Mallet. He directed two other stories in the late 80s, The First Segment of Trial and The Curse of Fenric. Mallet has never really particularly impressed me as a director, I'm sorry to say. And while we're not here to review Fenric, I will say I think he is actually the weak link in that story. His directing feels awkward and rushed sometimes. I think, for instance, the We Play the Contest Again cliffhanger is infinitely more effective on paper than it is on the screen because of it. Here, a lot of his choices do also harm, but with obviously a much weaker script than Fenric. For a start, a lot of his editing decisions are just baffling. The script structure doesn't help, but a lot of them seem designed to kill any possible tension or drama. The opening of the story, for instance, with a very stupid Yellow Can getting killed, and then the only slightly less stupid caretaker also getting killed, both of those intercut with scenes with the Doctor and Mel. A potential mystery is suddenly wrenched away from us just to watch them, and it's jarring when we return to it having been in the cosy TARDIS scene, etc. Mallet also makes things feel so utterly pedestrian. There was a lot working against him in the script, of course, but so many of the camera angles are flat and the editing boring, so menace and tension could come out a lot of these scenes, but there is none. A lot of the staging is downright terrible. The ending where Pex attacks the chief caretaker was never going to look good, but the pushing him slightly as they enter a lift shaft while everyone stands back and watches with slightly horrified expressions on their faces just looks absolutely absurd, and in no way captures any potential excitement. Again, the script was working against him here. The cutting back and forth probably was on the page, but nevertheless it feels like the realisation is the story's final nail in the coffin, and Mallet is unfortunately part of the reason behind that. Another important factor behind that is the terrible set and prop design. Rarely has Doctor Who ever looked quite so tacky yet also charmless. The sets look bland and soulless. You could well argue that's part of the point, to show the urban decay and all that, but there's a difference in portraying soulless and being soulless in execution. I don't get the sense this is somewhere that was meant to be a nice place to live that has degenerated. I get the sense this is a brown corridor made of styrofoam because, well, those are easy and cheap. It honestly looks like it comes from that game show, I think it was the Crystal Maze, that one Richard Ayoade did a few years ago. I think it was that. But yeah, the one where there was like Indiana Jones type stuff. This looks more like that, but it does a proper sci-fi set. It also doesn't help how boringly Mallet tends to shoot them, pretty much always head on, and well, the music finishes it off. The cleaners are another great example of this. They don't look like something designed to be pleasing as degenerated. They look like generic amorphous robots. Nothing is designed to indicate either the origins or current state of Paradise Towers. They have no menace, as evidenced by how easily escapable they are. Oh no, the claw has someone who has been bashed a few times and let them go. Hooray! And how, well, the music that comes on every time makes them sound even more plodding and generic than they look. Oh, and there's Caragnon, of course, who looks like a pink robot Mickey Mouse. That's a slight exaggeration, but only slight. Why anyone thought this would be an effective villain is totally beyond me. The thing looks like absolutely fucking ridiculous, and combined with the absolutely absurd voice...
Hungry? You can't be. Daddy's always made sure you get a good supply of what you need. Daddy's the chief caretaker, that's his main job.
This is one of the least impressive villains in the show's history. Until it turns into Richard Briers, and it becomes worse. Anyway, I did mention once or twice the music is the final nail in the coffin, and, well, I have made clear my dislike for the music of Keith McCulloch previously, and I can say very honestly that I don't think there's a single soundtrack of his I actually like. This is certainly the worst of the lot, though. Cheesy, totally lacking in atmosphere, without any kind of tension at all. It sounds like it comes from a schools program made in the 80s that you ended up watching at school in the 2000s. It absolutely destroys even the tiny amounts of atmosphere the story has mustered up to this point. The cleaners lumbering along the corridors was never going to be an impressive sight, but with this soundtrack from a crap 16-bit game, they just feel even less of a threat. McCulloch's soundtrack was a late replacement for another one, which you can find on YouTube if you want. While it's not great, it's certainly better than this, and ditching it as was, you guessed it, a JNT initiative, showing the kind of judgment that led to the show's fate more or less already being sealed by this point. And I want to make it clear, it's not as if all McCoy-era soundtracks were like this. Imagine a story with the atmospheric soundtracks from Greatest Show of the Galaxy, Ghostlight, Curse of Fenric. Well, it's not a flattering comparison for this story, is it? With the production, and I use that term loosely of course, out of the way, let's start a look at the script, with a look at the characters of the story. To start in the most logical place, it's clear that the Seventh Doctor started out with absolutely nobody knowing what to do with his character. Next season they would hit on it, but in season 24 his characterization is a confused mess, and you'll find no better advertisement for this than that story. I will give credit here that despite everything else, Sylvester McCoy is clearly trying. He's not to blame for anything wrong with any of this, and he does occasionally have moments even despite the material he's been given. For instance, on this viewing I appreciated a little more the bit when the Doctor escapes the caretakers using the rules. Now, on paper this is yet absolutely awful, it's yet another extension of probably the least funny joke in the whole story, but there's a bit of subtlety to McCoy's performance that is nice despite that. But most of the time he's lost, and it's difficult to blame him when he has nothing to work with. The result is just bland deliveries, interjected by moments of being over the top and pulling ridiculous facial expressions, which was a habit that was never really toned down as much as it should have been, but it's certainly much worse in this season than it was in the other two. The character as written comes across as clueless and ineffectual, nothing more than a bumbling fool. If Troughton's Doctor was the master of obfuscating stupidity, with a buffoonish exterior with the intelligence clearly on display in the performance, then this is perhaps the opposite. The story treats the Doctor as a cunning figure, but in actuality he spends pretty much the entire story bouncing around being captured by different groups, escaping only because of their stupidity, and giving the previously mentioned flat dialogue and ridiculous gurning throughout. At no point do I get the sense the Doctor has control over the situation, or indeed that he is influencing it in any way as the Seventh Doctor as he evolved would. He only finds out the plot through conveniently placed memories and a flipping instructional video, not through intelligence and powers of deduction. Not only does he come across as a total bumbling fool, he comes across as mostly a bystander. Given Watt started writing the story before McCoy was cast, it's not surprising the character isn't as he should be, but the clincher here is that any Doctor should be more than the Doctor is in this story. There are a few flashes, the previously mentioned escape scene, but that's all they are. And indeed, said escape scene is ruined by the shit comedy anyway, which kind of tells you the overall problem, doesn't it? As for his travelling companion, well look, you can firmly put Mel in the rescued by Big Finish camp for me, because in Big Finish she was portrayed as smart and resourceful, and played to Bonnie Langford's strengths as an actress. And I'm glad this is the version of the character that appeared in New Who last year, and not her classic series self, because Jesus Christ. Now, Langford gives a terrible performance in this story, but I don't think she's a bad actress at all because of Big Finish and her New Who appearance. And also, well, nobody was making this material good, but it is a terrible performance. The perby, high-pitched cheerleader was about the worst possible companion to have in a story like this, and she becomes grating very quickly. But the big problem is not in the performance, but in the actions, which is just unbelievable. First of all, basically this entire story happens because Mel wants to go swimming. Such a great and noble setup, really. And this whole story is basically her search for the swimming pool. Amongst everything going on, she has to get to the pool, sod the robots and cannibals, I need a swim. Yes, I know, she said she'd meet the Doctor there, but it still counts because of how contrived it is when a TARDIS would be a far more logical meeting point for someone who doesn't have the brain of a chipmunk. Oh, and obviously, what helps my argument here is the fact that when she arrives at the pool, despite the killer robots and cannibals, despite people being murdered in front of her eyes, she does actually go for a swim, which is a level of stupidity I don't even want to have to describe. It's very high, put it that way. It's frankly calmer that the random robot frog attacks her, but alas, not all idiocy can be punished in the way it should. But it certainly typifies her approach to this story, which is just idiocy of a whole nother level. Yes, Mel, of course you should trust these old ladies who are living comfortably with tea and crumpets when you've seen feral gangs and killer robots. That sounds completely legitimate and doesn't ring a single alarm bell, as long as you're a complete moron. She also spends most of the story talking down to Pex, and frankly just makes her come across as petty and unlikable. The man has a lot of guilt he's working through, and talking to you, I can assure you, is not making it any better for him. I have made my point anyway, this is undoubtedly one of the worst turns for a companion in the show's history. It's not on the same level as overriding the will of an entire world because of your ego, but it's not a million miles away. As for the supporting characters, I will first look at the only one who is not a complete and total embarrassment in every way, Pex. Pex has two very small things going for him. Firstly, Howard Cook's performance is the only one that isn't entirely embarrassing apart from McCoy, as there is a bit of depth to it. The original intent in the script was for Pex to be all muscled up like Arnie, and to that to provide the contrast of his cowardice, but that would have just been yet another one-note joke to be used into the ground and never once be funny, while just having him as a guy allows Cook to give a few shades to the performance. You do get the idea from him that this is someone covering up insecurities and guilt. Secondly, there is, in theory, an arc here, of his going from guilt and insecurity to the hero who saves the day. However, the problem is that all there is theory, because he spends most of the story either reusing one-note jokes, he breaks down the door, or being cowardly in a really pathetic way that just makes you absolutely pity him, and not in the intended way, before suddenly, right at the end of the story, he's a hero. It also doesn't help most of his backstory comes through exposition, either to a condescending Mel or while the Kangs are screaming their unintelligible nonsense at him, just to show us how annoying things can be in the story when they really want them to be. And that's the best the story can do. The Chief Caretaker is just an embarrassment all round, from Richard Briers' over-the-top performance to his weak and unclear motivations. Briers chews the scenery the entire story, but not in a good way like Graham Cowden in The Horns of Nimon, or indeed Edward Peel just 2 stories later in Dragonfire. This is an unpleasant, dull, and humorless performance. The cheesiness is over the top and the character suffers from it. Not that as much to suffer, because his motivations are unclear and confused, never does his lining up with the bad guy make much sense. He's no threat to him, all he does is give order his underlings around in his grating voice that sounds like this, while quoting the unfunny regulations to everyone, and he's certainly not funny. So what does he have? Well, awkwardness, of course, and as the way Briers delivers the dialogue describing Karanon as his pet and all that, it's just painful. And yet this performance somehow manages to get even worse. We'll get to it. The caretakers as a whole are pretty pathetic. They never come across as effective or threatening force, as of how easily they are outsmarted by pretty much everyone in Paradise Towers except for the old ladies. And they don't work as any kind of commentary on law enforcement because all they're there for is quoting their endless unfunny jokes about rules and regulations, which, as I said earlier, gives an unintended message about how police following rules is somehow a bad thing. Oh, and the Deputy Chief Caretaker, and altogether nothing of a character with an actor giving a bored performance, switches sides to join in the Avengers Assemble team up in Part 4. Not only is this whole thing frankly juvenile, we're all going to miraculously get along despite years of deep-seated resentment. Hooray! It's also laughable that the others would buy this. He's obviously just doing it to save his own skin, and if it was a cleverer story something would be made of that, but nope, he goes along with it and is happy to join in with rebuilding into a pleasant society or whatever at the end. Yeah, I can't see that going badly, with opposing sides that have essentially been in a state of war for years, having come together for all about half an hour. That sure sounds like the foundations of a stable society. Anyway, moving on to the Kangs. These little shits are so infuriating and annoying. My blood pressure was rising every time they were on the screen. Not only are they all played by terrible actresses who all give awkward and stilted deliveries, and not only is their constant crowing and screaming extremely grating, they employ one of my least favourite science fiction tropes, the speaking in broken English to show how alien they are thing, which always annoys me to no end and is absolutely fucking insufferable here. I, funnily enough, want to be able to understand what the characters are saying, and when I can't, it is just going to piss me off and take me out of the story.
They wipe away our wall scroll, chase us down corridors.
All sound and safe.
The young doctor and the girl who's no Kang are lost for now.
And no exit?
No exit's not here.
Where is she?
Was on Talkie-Phone 3 before caretakers attacked.
He dropped down, Doctor. Whoosh! Into our brain quarters.
English, motherfucker! Do you speak it?
And it's that, basically every time they're on screen. It drives me fucking insane, and I absolutely hate every single moment they are on screen. Oh, by the way, the dumbest Kang isn't even one we hear talk, for it is the yellow Kang at the start, who escapes from the other Kangs, hears them say the cleaners will get her, then completely lets her guard down to be killed by a cleaner and about 10 seconds later. It really cannot be stated how stupid someone has to be warned of a threat, then immediately get caught by said threat when an escape was easily possible, all within less time than it sings to hum Frere Jacka. It starts the story as it means to go on, extremely idiotically. And then we come to Karagnon, the story's big villain. Karagnon may be one of the worst villains in the history of Doctor Who, and I do not use that lightly given what Doctor Who has put on the screen over the years. Karagnon is a famous architect of places like Paradise Towers, before he went mad and disappeared after creating Paradise Towers. How do I know this? Why, I listened to the Doctor and Kangs watch an informational film on it, of course. Exposition by documentary, always a classic. The mere thought of providing and developing this information organically probably didn't even cross White's mind, to be honest. This is evident when it becomes clear just how painfully underdeveloped Karagnon is as a villain. I honestly still cannot tell you how he managed to become an evil, disembodied computer. This is just something we're supposed to accept has happened. His motivations are unclear throughout the story. Firstly, it seems as if he's mindlessly looking for food, as frequently shown with irrelevant interruptions to the main plot, so the Chief Caretaker can exchange the previously mentioned awkward dialogue, and Karagnon can reply with the previously mentioned hungry bullshit. The switch over to his being the big bad is both painfully obvious as soon as Karagnon is mentioned as a character, and extremely abrupt and undeveloped. How human bodies provide him with sustenance is of course a mystery, and I think Watt didn't care. It just sounds cool him going hungry like that, so that's why it was put in. And as if New Who and its stupid monster catchphrases that I've already mentioned weren't bad enough. We get this years earlier. Then he takes over the chief caretaker, and Briar's performance sinks to absolutely new lows. The zombie-like performance feels like it comes straight out of a pantomime. It's what you'd expect from a kid dressed as a zombie trick-or-treating. It's painful, and what's more, it adds nothing to the character, as we still don't really understand his motivation. He wants to take over his creation again, apparently, for, like, power and order and all of that stuff. The slowing of the speech from Briar's terrible performance destroys what very little credibility any of this would have had. Finally, we'll look at the Rezzies, Tilda and Tabby the cannibals. Oh, I hate these guys. They're just appallingly acted, the worst kind of gratingly cheesy performance, and they have this uncanny valley thing to them, but not in the these guys are hiding a terrible secret thing that's intended. They're just really awkward and off, like these are like Martians trying to disguise themselves as old ladies, instead of the old ladies being turned to monstrosities by society that was the message. In any case, the attempted cannibalism of Mel is really disturbing, frankly. It's the kind of gratuitous, senseless violence they went overboard with in Season 22 that arguably got the show into this mess to begin with, and it's in service of absolutely nothing. It's really quite unpleasant and only adds to the massive tonal issues this story has, which we'll look at later. Anyway, I want to quickly look at the plot structure, which strikes me as fairly emblematic of many of the problems this story has. As I mentioned, the whole thing happens because Mel wants to go for a swim, which just sort of show the attitude taken to having things to come together believably and come together in a compelling narrative, that it doesn't really need to. The plot progresses in the most awkward and stilted ways possible, usually through lengthy exposition, such as the previously mentioned documentary. We're basically told the plot as it goes on, and all the stuff happening on the screen is just a bit of a side thing, which is not really the way to approach storytelling. The actual story of Paradise Towers, of how the villain built all this stuff, became part of the towers. Meanwhile, the war happened and the towers just became the example of urban decay. None of this is developed organically, it's all just told through awkward exposition, which is a problem because it means none of it lives up to its potential, the plot, or the themes that result from them. There is a potential with the story, the ideas are not the worst part of it, but it's the way they are structured that causes them to be executed so poorly. This awkward and lazy structure means the idea is not explored full stop. But of course you didn't want me to talk about serious structures when it comes to the plot. You wanted, yes, the plot holes. Well, I just want to quickly start by saying there's absolutely no explanation to how Cragnon managed to become a disembodied computer, but more importantly, there's never really explained why either. Apparently the original inhabitants put him there because, I don't know, they wanted to. I already spoke at length about how nothing about Cragnon makes sense, but the fact he's even there to begin with, trapped in his own creation where his escape would seem more likely than if you just trapped him somewhere random or just killed him, it just makes absolutely no sense. However, the biggest hole in this story is the backstory, because oh my god, is it a perfect example of how not to do world building, and the complexity of this is why Spanish Flea isn't playing as it has been done before with these plot hole bits, because I think I need to talk a bit. The basic premise is that there was a far-off war, with those eligible to fight going off to do so, while those not coming to the titular towers to live safely. This does have promise, but it fails so astonishingly flat in its execution. First of all, there's no context given to this. Where are we? What species are these people? Where is the war happening? Why is the war happening? Is it a just war? What caused it to start? What time period of this? All of these questions go completely unanswered, just leaving the viewer to guess. It's not information that in itself is important to know, but the fact it's totally ignored belies the approach, namely the shut up and think what we want you to think approach. Anyway, all the adults were taken off the fight. What, all of them? Even the most harshest real-life conscriptions have tended to focus on able-bodied young people. Real-life conscriptions have obviously tended to exclude women, but I'm guessing in the future / on this planet that's not the case. But not literally everyone. Now, granted, the caretaker seems to have some kind of exemption, which has to be inferred because it's never actually confirmed, but whatever. But a society fighting war needs more than just the police and the janitors. Who's sorting out their food supply? Who's practicing medicine? Who's keeping the electricity on and the water running? Some adults are clearly needed to provide childcare and indeed to continue having babies in order for the reproductive cycle to continue. These obvious points are just completely ignored. All the men between the ages of 12 and 80 went off the war. Except Pex. Yes, there was one solitary draft dodger in this entire species-wide conflict. Just this one guy. If that's not stretching credulity enough, the Kangs are all obviously girls, so what, they took the baby boys off the war as well? He's not old enough to shit in a toilet, but by God can he hold a rifle. Also, it's clear that this has been some time since this happened, as the Kangs are in their mid to late teens but have clearly not grown up with any adult supervision, which means that they were obviously essentially left alone as babies in this place. But the Rezzies have seemingly aged very little. Oh, and they're solely women as well, which means that both the toddlers and the octogenarians are on the front lines in this conflict, which makes the timescale extremely strange. This is made even more baffling by the contradiction throughout the story on how long it's been, sometimes implied just to be a few months even, but again, the Kangs have grown to adulthood, so clearly a good few years. Some of the caretakers we see are clearly quite young men, not that much older than the Kangs, and that's the same for Pex as well. How have these people grown up, and if there's nobody here to have babies, Where did they come from? Now, nitpicking isn't just poking holes. It's also making sure that the universe a story creates is consistent and makes sense, and a story badly fails that. If you cannot convince me that this world the story is taking place in is real and makes sense, then why should I take it seriously? As far as I know, the society is full of lunatics who think that children barely off breastfeeding would make perfect commandos. And what indication am I ever given that this is not the case? None. The world the story exists in is fundamentally implausible and is one of the story's biggest flaws. Which brings us onto the themes and ideas, and the idea of the story is to be a commentary on urban decay, showing me the idea of the high-rise building and the debate about them that's been a regular one when it comes to the British housing market. It's also pretty nakedly inspired by High Rise by J.G. Ballard. I haven't read it so I can't say for sure, but from what I can tell it's inspired in kind of the same way the British Museum inspired the Elgin marbles from Athens. The problem, however, is very much in the execution and not the idea, which, as I said, is not bad. As I stated at the start, the messages are confused. The idea of the caretakers representing corrupt law enforcement is barely there. There's like 2 scenes where they complain about the graffiti right amidst the actual problems of urban decay, and one where the chief caretaker tries to bribe one of the resis. That's honestly about it. As I've said, it seems more like they're saying they shouldn't have to follow all these damn rules that they keep repeating. I repeat myself, obviously unintentional, but it's what I get far more from the story than what was intended. The story also sabotages its own message because of how we got here. This isn't really a commentary on human nature and societal decay and how capitalism accelerates that and all you'd expect from a story of this era. We're in this situation because of the badness of one villain who's motivated by ego and power rather than greed as you'd expect, and highly specific circumstances led to this, which never gives you the idea this is in any way a mirror of urban Britain as you'd expect it to be. The feral kids roaming the streets is on the nose, but doesn't even work on that basic level because it's not being said because it's because of a failure of a society to look after them. It's being said because, well, they all implausibly fucked off the war and let the babies look after themselves. This is undermined in 2 ways. Firstly, as I mentioned, world building is important, and the poor world building here has undermined the message. Secondly, well, the poor structure and confused messages all lead to the overall message being unclear. If only we could all get along, we'll defeat the big bad, the architect of everything. Eh? Who's now like a power-hungry generic villain. Shouldn't it be like the ills of society for this to be a proper message that's working? For what it's trying to do, it's not work. It does not work. The final thing I want to discuss is the idea of fun, and how this results in A, the massive tonal mismatch that is the death blow for this story, and B, the testing of my patience. Now, obviously fun is very subjective, it's about as far from something that can be objectively looked at as there is. Doctor Who is an obvious example of this. As I stated at the start, so much New Who's spectacle bullshit is found to be fun by a lot of people. I vehemently disagree, but hey, that's what they think. This story very much falls into that category as its fun derives from the mindlessness of it. It's a bit campy and silly, so that falls into the idea of fun, and I don't agree for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's not particularly fun, as the jokes aren't funny. I've mentioned several times the rules and regulations stuff, but hearing every long regulation number being quoted several times is enough to drive me to rage, and it never even approaches being funny, and campiness on its own does not equal fun to me. But even if it did, fun to me is the idea of being able to sit back and enjoy without having any kind of intellectual burden or anything to think about. And this story does not qualify because it's unpleasant to watch and there's so much thematic shit that supposedly is in it anyway. None of it works, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Secondly, well, tonally the story is a disaster, and it's by far and away its biggest problem. Now, if the story had genuinely committed to the camp fun approach, I wouldn't have liked it, but I would have at least respected it for going something I did not like. I think the return of Dr. Mysterio is pretty bad, and utter farce if there ever was one, but I can at least respect it for going what it wanted to go for. But instead we get this story's jokes, or to use the approach of jokes it uses, jokes 1162b/5 subsection 15, with a bit of awful slapstick thrown in for good measure, alongside a story about the ills of urban and societal decay, with cannibalism and gangs of feral teenagers with crossbows. How am I supposed to take it seriously as a comedy when I have to watch horribly unpleasant scenes of Mel nearly being eaten and people being murdered by the cleaners? How am I supposed to take it seriously as a drama when I have to listen to the caretakers reading out the same long number over and over again, and that somehow being treated as a joke? It's not that you have to entirely stick to one thing. City of Death is one of the greatest stories of all time, and it perfectly blends comedy and drama. But there both are weaved into the story as a whole. The jokes supplement the clever plot. Here everything is haphazardly thrown together. We go from unpleasant cannibals to Pex breaking down the door, which is somehow comedy in itself. There's no fault to the structure, it's just a complete and total mess. This story fails in every measure for me. The stuff I didn't even really fit into this. The dialogue, for instance, is absurdly weak, just lame flat exposition most of the time. The production is poor, the plot ill thought out, the theme's mangled, and all the character work fails. I hate the story, but as I said at the start, it doesn't inspire anger anymore, just frustration and discontentment. I sat through thinking, Christ, are we done yet? Not wanting to see any more. Now, obviously in hindsight, this probably wasn't the show's last chance saloon, that had been and gone, and the animated corpse of the show would have gone on for a few more seasons no matter what. But that stories like this were being put out when a new audience was desperately needed, it just shows the level of dysfunction for show as being put out was. I hope even someone who likes the story can acknowledge that anyone sitting down and watching this as their first taste of the show might be put off a bit. And well, this was a season with giant brains, 50s tourist buses, and Arnie's Mr. Freeze done a decade early. It was a sign of how rotten the core of the show had become, and frankly it makes the achievement of turning the final two seasons into something that was on the road to recovery even more impressive despite the axe sadly falling. Anyway, final score for this story is 0 out of 10, the worst of the classic series. I won't repeat myself much further, I'll simply say that the ideas here are not bad at all, and had they been better executed I think it would have called itself out the bottom spot. But when everything on the screen is so poorly made and nothing is done with the words on the page, well, it's an inescapable conclusion. This is admittedly a lot closer than the New Who decision was. Perhaps on a better day I'll look back and go, damn, why didn't I choose the Twin Dilemma or something instead? But make no mistake, I hate this story and will never think it's anything other than terrible. So, happy April Fool's Day. That out of the way, I actually don't know what I'm doing next time, so you'll find out when I do. Stick around.